This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. Welcome to the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast. I'm your host, co-founder, and editorial director of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, Jamie Bogner. We are on the fourth episode of a crazy lager tear here for the podcast. I didn't do it intentionally, but I just kind of realized the schedule oriented, so we had 4 lager brewers in a row, which shouldn't be a thing. We've had 4 ale brewers in a row, many times. So I don't even know why I'm pointing that out as something special. This episode is one that I was excited about doing. We are taking this episode straight from the cover of our summer issue of the Brewing Industry Guide. And Lisa Allen, head brewer for Heater Allen in McMinnville, Oregon, is joining us for the podcast. Welcome to the podcast, Lisa.
Thanks for having me.
You've got a fun family story with a homegrown family approach to lager brewing, and it's I can't wait to dig into how, why, and what you all do. But first, like your flagship beer, you can rely on G&D chillers for the same quality and consistency. G&D guarantees that every chiller they build will hit 28 degrees without breaking a sweat. They never stop. They draft, they craft, they service each and every brewery, big or small, all in an effort to build one hell of a chiller. For nearly 30 years, G&D has been committed to cold. Reach out for a quote today at gdchillers.com. This episode is also brought to you by RAR North Star Pils, a new base malt to set your compass by. RAR North Star Pils is crafted for brewers looking for a domestic Pilsner malt with low color and low modification. North Star Pils carries overtones of honey and sweetbread, supported by flavors and aromas of hay and a nutty character. Suitable for any beer style, but particularly craft brewed versions of classic lagers. Let RAR North Star Pils guide your craft by visiting bsgcraftbrewing.com or contact them at 1-800-374-2739. So like I said, if you want that full background story on Heater Allen and their approach to business, life, brewing, and everything else, check out the latest issue of the Brewing Industry Guide. And for all of you that have industry all access subscriptions, I'm sure you have already read it. We're going to dive a little more deeply into the lager brewing approach for Heater Allen. And there is some of that in the story because Joe definitely dove into the way that you all brew Pilsner. We're going to cover some of that ground also, but I certainly encourage you to check out that story. Lisa, for those who have yet to read that story, why don't you share some of your background, how your arc into brewing progressed and how you got to this point now making the beer for Heater Allen?
So my dad started Heater Allen in 2007, kind of on a nano brew system. And then after a year, graduated to a 7-barrel system, which actually is now at Wolves and People in Newburgh. And I came on to the brewery in 2009, at the end of 2009. I actually worked in wine prior to working in beer. I was went to go work at the brewery to help my dad out because he was kind of, I think, a little bit in over his head. The brewery was getting more popular and he definitely needed help. And then also I think had scheduled a joint replacement of some sort in there. So I went to go work for him and thought it was going to be a temporary thing. I was still taking wine classes while I was working. And then went and worked one more harvest, took a month off from the brewery in fall of 2010. And after that decided that I wanted to stick with beer. So I've been at the brewery ever since. And still enjoy wine, but, I've always loved beer, so it wasn't really that hard of a transition. Beer has always kind of been a part of my life, I feel, in some way. Growing up, my dad was a home brewer, and was my uncle. And then, I always really liked beer. So I grew up in the Portland area. So I grew up grew up around the craft scene. I mean, obviously not really because I wasn't
Sure, you were a
drinking
kid.
right away. But yeah, I mean, I remember going to McMinimans when those first were a thing with my parents. And I mean, my parents were supporters of craft beer. They always had different, Deschutes, Bridgeport,
Sure.
all that sort of stuff in the fridge.
Living the lifestyle.
Yeah, so I feel like I grew up around it, and I feel when I did start drinking, I feel like I was that like annoying, 19-year-old that was asking my friends that were of age to like buy me a 6-pack of Mirapon instead of like just getting, Coors Light or Bud Light or whatever anyone, they were buying for everyone else. So
That's fantastic. So you came up familiar with craft beer.
yeah.
And it was
yeah,
just
totally.
something that you're always around.
Yep. Yeah.
And so then you step in to help Dad with production at this small brewery where dedicated to lager brewing. Talk to me a little bit about focusing that brewery in the early days on lager brewing, because that was a weird move for Oregon in 2007, 2009.
Yeah, I think originally, I mean, those were the beers I think my dad wanted to drink, which was why he wanted to start a brewery that specialized in lagers. And no one was really doing it. There are a couple of breweries that every once in a while would come out with, a Pilsner. But no one had anything on their main beers that they were producing at the time.
And certainly not a lineup of multiple lagers that are year-round things, and that is all that they focus the brewery on and brew, right?
Exactly.
Maybe a couple at that point around the country, but certainly not, yeah.
Yeah, in the area it was not very common. And so, he just, kind of, and that's why he was a nano brewery, I think, to start, was because he was kind of seeing if there was a market for it in the Portland area.
Nano brewing making lagers. That sounds like a business recipe for disaster.
I know. Well, so, I mean, he didn't have any investors or anything like that. So this is, his way of kind of doing it slowly and, making so he could actually do it.
Sure.
And then after a year, he was like, well, I either need to get out of the beer business or I need to get a bigger system because this is not sustainable as being a nano lager brewery.
Right.
So that's when we went to the 7-barrel system. And now we're on a 15-barrel system. I should say that too. We're not still brewing on a little system. And just kind of had this idea of like growing slowly. And as, I think too, we've kind of just grown with lagers in a sense. Not in that like craft lagers. I feel like it's, they've slowly gotten more popular and, we've kind of slowly grown the business, up with that. So
that late 2000s would have been like some expats who had spent time in Germany and Czechoslovakia or the Czech Republic and wanted those beers that they might have had back then, but there weren't as many. Like it was still the prime time of craft versus lager, in American craft beer, where certain breweries were trying to, fight this made-up fight against the very idea of lager. Throwing everything into the lager side of the thing would have been a pretty bold move.
Yeah, and I will say too, like I think I do think the thing that me coming into the brewery, because I had worked at, even though it is, different, obviously, working at wineries, but my dad had never worked at a production facility before.
Right,
he had never, he had gone and, did brew days with folks and like toured breweries and things like that. But there were certain aspects I think that I brought into it just from that point of view of being like, oh, well, we should do this. And did you think about doing this? And all of those sorts of things.
So you were in production, doing some sort of production for wineries?
Yeah, I primarily worked harvests was my,
okay. Sure.
I also had experience doing tasting room stuff too, but I really liked the production side of it. So yeah, that is primarily what I did. It's, for a winery, you're really busy during one time of the year, and then you can kind of coast the rest of the year. So
you get into the brewery and you're working with your father and your dad, Rick.
Yeah.
And what role did you take on, and how did you all decide to kind of move together through this business?
I think he originally hired me primarily to clean kegs.
Sure.
It was
smart. Because who wants to do that?
Exactly. And we didn't have a keg washer at the time, so it was a very manual process.
Oh.
We didn't kind of rigged something up, so we weren't like taking out spears every time,
right.
But we like had a little system to do it. And I like to joke that buying a keg washer was my first raise at the brewery. So then, it got to the point where I needed to do other things and couldn't because it was so slow cleaning kegs the way we did. Like right. All the kegs we had, I think once it got to taking me 2 days to clean all the kegs I had to clean, then it was like, okay, we need to fix this.
You just need to make more beer so that you can make more money to buy the keg washer. And then,
exactly.
Then you get into the endless hamster wheel of funding the next investment that you then need to sell more beer in order to pay for.
Exactly.
Where do you go from washing kegs? At some point, obviously, spending 2 days washing kegs sucks, and you want to do something that's a little bit more creative and rewarding, within the brew house as a whole.
Yeah, I would say originally after cleaning kegs and that sort of thing, I really kind of became a cellar person. The process we would do with our beer required racking the beer out of one tank into another, like racking out a fermenter into one tank and then racking out of your like bright tank into essentially like a lagering or out of lagering tank to a bright tank. And so it was a lot of then like cleaning tanks, moving beer, all of that sort of stuff. And it's a small business too. So I also did things like I delivered once a week for probably the first, I think 3 or 4 years I worked for the brewery. Because we self-distribute for the most part. And I think you wear a lot of hats and that sort of stuff. And then as I'm doing the cellar work as well, starting to learn more about the brewing process and then helping with brew days and things like that. I think it took a while for my dad to actually, no, I take that back. I was going to say, cause I brewed when he was out with his hip, I did brew by myself. So that was probably spring of 2010. So, but he was very like controlling, I think in those early days, like not wanting me to like mess anything up or anything like that. So.
Which I can totally understand as a like parent-child dynamic that you love your kids and you want to teach your kids and you want to bring your kids to that. And yet at the same time, your kids are never going to be ready, because you just know them too well. And so, no, I get that. I would love to let's talk next about how you kind of moved from the kind of general brewery tasks and then started taking over, more of the brewing role. But before we do that, the world of craft beer is a different place now. Margins are more important than ever. So why not lower your ingredient cost? Craft juice concentrates from Old Orchard are the cost-effective solution for your fruit-forward needs. Old Orchard produces high volumes of their retail juice brand, so economies of scale keep prices low for their bulk supply program. A little concentrate goes a long way, and you won't lose some of it through filtering like you would with purees. To start increasing your margins now, head on over to www.oldorchard.com/brewer. Also, with nearly 20 years of innovation and experience, Brewmation specializes in electric, steam, and direct fire brew houses, complete cellar solutions, and automated controls for the craft brewing industry. From a half-barrel to 30-barrel systems, Brewmation puts you in control to design a brewery that fits your needs and brewing style. Whether you're starting a new brewery, upgrading your cellar, or just need some parts to keep you up and running, Brewmation has you covered. Visit them at brewmation.com to get started. So, Lisa, at some point here, you went from Dad letting you brew when he was out getting a hip replaced to kind of taking over the reins on the brew house. Talk to me about that kind of process and how that transition went.
I think I will say it was a pretty slow process.
Sure.
Looking back on it now, too.
A lot of earning trust.
Yeah, exactly. And it was one of those things where it just kind of all of a sudden slowly became me brewing more and more by myself, and him having to do other things, him definitely taking more of he's always done the business stuff, but just being busier with all of that stuff.
Sure.
And so
the growth itself and that growth of lager finally got to a point where he needed to do more of the other things too.
Yeah. I think it was also when I felt I could, like, I think when it's your parent too,
Sure.
I started kind of,
or even felt like you wanted to do it, right?
Yeah. I wanted to do it and being like,
this is going to be this path you're going to follow.
Yeah. Like being like, we should do this. Like, I'm going to start doing this now. And I think once I started kind of doing that stuff, he was like, okay, I can safely pass this on to you. I trust that the beer is in good hands. So even though I'd been, dealing with it for years. So.
Oh, okay. just mildly passive aggressive, but no, that's okay, Dad. I can do this now. You can take the training wheels off. No, that definitely sounds like me even dealing with my own kids in that kind of scenario. Like, can you do it? I'm teaching my 16-year-old to drive right now, or 15-year-old how to drive right now, and it's I think a similar process where there will come a point where he's just going to drive. And he won't be ready for that, in my mind, until he's at least 18. But he's going to be doing it before that. And I'm just going to have to be okay with that. But I think I enjoy what you say. Like, there was a point where you started making your own judgments, driving your own, making creative suggestions, technical suggestions, process. And we're approaching the art of brewing and the craft of brewing, from your own perspective, which reflects this kind of internalized drive and intrinsic motivation, which certainly says, hey, maybe I'm ready for more of this.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it was. And I think too, he wanted to step back from doing some of the physical things as well. So I think that it was like a good transition time. I left him for, I think it was like almost 3 weeks to go on a trip to Germany. And I think that him doing all the cellar work and brewing by himself again for just that short amount of time, he's like, okay, I think I'm ready to definitely take a step back from this.
Where was the moment where you started thinking, hey, this is how I think we should improve things in the brew house?
I can't remember an exact moment. I think part of it was as I kind of got more confident and also like meeting other brewers that I felt comfortable talking to, and just kind of going out more, going to like CBCs and going to more MBAA conferences and kind of being like, we don't do that. And then why don't we do that? And then like looking into it and being like, we should do that type of thing. Like, right. It's an easy thing to do. Why don't we do this? So just things like that. And because my dad never had a traditional, education in brewing or anything like that. I think he still did stuff in some ways how you would if you were a home brewer, which is perfectly fine, but you have to change some things once I think you especially get to a certain size. And so it was kind of realizing some of those things and changing some of those things. And also I don't have a huge, long education in beer, but I've, did a UC Davis short course, which I think helped a lot too, kind of learning more technical side of brewing, because I, know the science of alcohol from the wine side, but kind of learning more the technical side of the beer side is very helpful. And so going to a couple of courses and stuff like that, I think helped, as well as, like I said earlier, just going to like MBA conferences and things like that.
Sure.
Talking to other people. And as people started to make more lagers too. So.
Sure. What was the first beer that you concepted, executed, and were truly happy with?
That would be the Sticka Alt. That was really my first beer that I would say that I like did the complete recipe for. And that was, it was a while after I started the brewery. This, again, control freak.
Sure.
And that was fall of 2013. And we still do that beer. So, it's in our regular rotation. But yeah, that was the first beer I really did. And I was happy with it. I was happy with how it turned out. I've always tweaked it a little bit. I would say the other beer I've been working on the last few years is it's like a Franconian, we call it a Franconian amber lager called Zwickel beer, which bothers a lot of people, I guess, but whatever. The fact that we call it Zwickel beer. But I've been super happy with that beer, especially this last version. That's
why does that bother people?
I think it bothers people
because it's
for
not
some
pale
reason.
enough.
They assume a Zwickel beer should be like a Pilsner,
right.
And a Zwickel beer can be any
Sure.
beer, really. So,
right.
So I think that bothers people, but. Those little things.
I'm not saying that lager purists are just out there itching for an argument over things. Not saying that at all. But there might be a few of those folks out there in the broader beer world.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the Heater Allen approach to brewing. It's a challenge that every lager brewer makes to both adhere to tradition and to build these beers that fit within a broader idea of these things. And because that kind of classification and that idea of what these beers are is important to people, these beers have to both fit within that tradition and then somehow also exhibit a character that is, somehow, representative of your brewery's approach to brewing. How do you all navigate that kind of big question when it comes to lager brewing, finding a character for what Heater Allen means, what that approach is, what that point of view, that you can apply to that so that these beers don't just taste like a cookie cutter approximation of something that somebody's tasted in Europe at some point in the past, but also reflect this kind of creative idea that you all bring to it?
Yeah, I think that as I think a lot of other lager brewers will say, the biggest thing for us is time. We give our beers a long amount of lagering time. So from for our pills, our flagship, from brew day to when we release that is at least 8 weeks. So it's usually 2 weeks in fermenter and then goes in lagering tank for 6. I would say the other thing that is really different about us at Heater Allen is that we don't fine or filter. And we're just relying on time for that, for clarity. And I think that gives our beers a definite character.
How would you define, do you articulate that character in some sort of way?
Yeah, I mean, I do think it has, because you do get a little bit of that. I think you do get a little bit of yeast character. And to me, I think it comes across as like a breadiness that, especially in our Pilsner, which I'm drinking right now, you get kind of, it's almost like a fresh kind of bread character that you get. That I think is, you get that in other beers as well, but it's kind of like different. It's like a little more pronounced, I would say, than in other beers. And I think that it's not necessary. I'm getting that definitely I get that in the Pilsner. I don't think it's necessarily in all of our beers. But in the Pilsner, I think the combination of the Saaz hops and the fact that it is unfiltered you get this really kind of nice, this nice, really breadiness to it.
Now, unfiltered doesn't mean hazy or turbid. It just simply means like the very faintest little bit of cloudiness that just happens after everything drops out, and there's still a little bit of of yeast and protein and whatnot in that beer, right?
Yeah. Most of the time, this got shook around, but the beer I'm drinking isn't. It's pretty clear. But yeah, I think most of the time our beer, by the time we're canning it, is pretty clear. You do, I think, you will get like a little bit of haze to it. Sometimes too, I think, you can leave a little bit in the can. Because the yeast settles really nicely in
Right.
whatever package it's in. So as long as you pour it slowly, and you can get a nice clear color.
I love listening to lager brewers, comparing the brightness of the beer. When I was talking to Dusan of Live Oak, he was focusing on how they use corn because it just makes that beer that much more sparkly, comparatively. And I mean, look, like from a visual perspective, you are parsing out some of the finest finest points of clarity there. But it's amazing to see that, that lager brewers in particular do get down to that kind of granular level of thinking about the actual color and, transparency and clarity of the beer in these incredibly fine gradations to differentiate between each other. Nonetheless, let's talk about your cellaring process, because obviously that's a big piece of this that feeds into that kind of longer lagering time and that unfiltered end. What does that cellaring process looks like? And I'll work backwards and then talk later, about ingredients and approach too. But I'm curious about that because you mentioned earlier transferring into lagering tanks to brights. What's that sequence of fermentation look like for you all?
We actually don't transfer. We don't. We're not moving the beer twice anymore. Typically, okay. We have better tanks now. So this is the old school tank that we had to. Did not have a racking arm or anything, and so we essentially had to come off the bottom of the tank. And so we, in order to prevent a ton of yeast, we'd usually rack it out of fermenter, let it sit for about 2 weeks, and then rack it into another tank that we would then package from. So now, we have, I think too, if I were to set up a brewery now, I would set it up completely different, but I'm sure probably like most brewers say that. We have a bunch of 15-barrel, they're actually upright tanks. And so most of our beer gets lagered in those, and those have racking arms. So we are just taking off the racking arm.
You are the cylindroconical school of lager brewing.
Yeah. We do have, and we would prefer to have more horizontals. We do have 2 30-barrel horizontal tanks. Those are great. Those are relatively new to our addition. And then we have one big 30-barrel upright as well, which that one I have been trying to use for package. So the horizontals don't. It's really hard, especially they're stacked on top of each other. So the bottom one is really hard to can out of. And so I've actually we've been racking out of that one into the 30-barrel upright. So that's been great, but I wasn't able to do that this last time. So it's like the tank juggling is real. When you have beer that needs to, sit in a tank for 6 weeks, it's sometimes difficult to kind of juggle everything around and figure out how stuff is going to work.
You've painted yourself into this corner with 8-week lagering times.
I know.
And so, it is what you just, brew an ale with a 14-day turn and get it out of a tank and not have to worry about all of that. But then it wouldn't be a Heater Allen beer.
Exactly.
From a yeast process, obviously that's a major contributor to character for every lager brewer that we talk to. Talk to me about the Heater Allen approach to yeast.
So I'm actually fiddling a lot with how we do yeast, but this is just like how I harvest and stuff like that. Reading
with different strains.
Reading more things, not with different strains.
Yeah.
We use 3470 BSI, we ferment at 50 degrees. We do not do a diacetyl rest.
No, why not?
We have found that we haven't had an issue with diacetyl because we let our beer lager for so long. I will say, so I said 2 weeks in fermenter, but I mean, sometimes fermentation takes longer. So we spooned everything. Everything is naturally carbonated. So I just have a period of time where I'm just like, okay, it has to have spooned it and like reached final. And then after this long, then I will like rack it into a lagering tank. So I do have like a little bit of a process. But it was really funny because I, came from wine and I, working for my dad, who is pretty much, just been at Heater Allen. And I remember the first time I heard someone, I mean, this was early on, but someone was talking about diacetyl rest. And I was like, diacetyl rest? What's a diacetyl rest? Just because we never did it. And then I looked into it and I was like, do I need to do this? And it's like, well, we don't really have a problem with diacetyl, so I guess I don't need to do it. And I knew what diacetyl was. Obviously, I just had never experienced a diacetyl rest.
Well, there's so many other things that can feed into it. It's all about looking at that process that works with the ingredients in brewhouse that you use. And so you can say there's a right or wrong. There's not really. There's just the way that produces the beer that you want it, that you want to, call Heater Allen beer.
Yeah.
So are there, other impacts there? Like, are you using base malt, Pilsner malt that that tends to not throw off as much diacetyl? Are you boiling more rigorously, or at an altitude, or something that is potentially volatilizing those compounds faster that might not require a diacetyl rest?
I actually think a lot of it has to do with yeast. Actually, I think that if you I think leaving the beer on the yeast actually really helps. The 3470 is great at, I think it's, in my experience, it's a low diacetyl producing yeast anyway. That's not to say in the right conditions it will not produce diacetyl. Sure. But I think that, we have always had a tendency to kind of overpitch a little bit. And so part of me kind of wonders if that has to do with it as well. And now, like I mentioned, we're kind of starting to change how we do yeast a little bit, just trying to make sure we have healthier yeast and all of that. So, because we actually did have a little blip with diacetyl. It was a very small blip, and so I think it had to do with yeast.
What happened?
Though it was just, I mean, in very small quantities. I think one of our batches had a little bit of diacetyl in it, and I think it was because we actually, I think we just moved out of fermenter too fast. Honestly, is what happened. I was trying to get beer moved, and moved it into lagering tank a little bit sooner than it should have been moved into lagering tank. So, but yeah, and I do think it was a yeast health issue too. I think that I think it was slightly that I think that batch was like slightly underpitched. And underpitched rather than overpitched. So yeah, which is why we're honing in our yeast practices.
When you say we, there are two of you that work in the brew house, right?
Yeah. So I have.
It's a pretty expansive staff of.
I know. I have in fall 2019. We we hired help. I have a cellar guy. Although I should say maybe assistant brewer. He's pretty much trained on the brew house now. Matt.
You
and
won't
he's been
quite
great.
let him do it all by himself. Is that what you're saying?
No, I know I'm kind of controlling too.
Right.
like father, like daughter. No, he's I mean, there's just certain small things to remember and stuff like that. Like I think any brewer will
Sure.
tell you. And, so yeah, but I'm pretty confident that he could brew by himself. But yeah.
So it's the two of you, and you brew around 1,500 barrels of beer this year?
This year this is
a weird
COVID
year.
kind of messed us up. In 2019 we did, I think, just under 1,500 barrels. And then, I mean, if we would have, it was early in the year, but we were on track. If things had been going as they had in 2020, we probably would have been about the same, maybe closer to 1,500, maybe slightly over. Instead, I think we were about 1,200 barrels. And then I think we're on kind of track to do between 13 and 14 this year so far. So we've upped those numbers a little bit.
But still a small cult lager making business over there.
Yeah. Yeah. We grow slowly. We're growing slowly.
Sure. Well, let's talk about some of the other parts of your lager brewing process. Before we do that, there's nothing easy about brewing beer. It's an intricate, time-consuming art. The last thing you need to face is a recall or contamination that can hurt your pride and your pocketbook. Clarion lubricants meet strict purity and performance standards to help make your system 100% food safe. That's protection for your equipment and for your beer. So make the switch to Clarion and ensure your system is running smooth and safe. Go to clarionlubricants.com to learn more. So we've talked a little bit about cellaring, and you lager for 8 weeks, fermentation, it's pretty typical, 3470. You overpitch a bit. Any temperature concerns around fermentation that, or are you right in the 3470 sweet spot?
Yeah, we ferment at 50. So, just right kind of, I would say right kind of in the middle of that.
Right.
So yeah, the sweet spot.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And then is there anything interesting or peculiar about, temperature curves crashing or, any of that other process around this?
We don't crash. We lower the temperature slowly. So we're trying to make sure that we don't shock the yeast too much. So we lower the temperature before we move about 3 degrees a day and before we move into lagering tank. So by the time we move into lagering tank, we're at about 41 degrees. And then our lagering temperature is right around 35, 36. And these are all in Fahrenheit, just so people know.
Sure. That would be a pretty rough lager at 36 degrees.
Little hot.
Yeah. That's your quake temperature. And you mentioned you minimize transfers now. Is that just new tank stuff, or are there other kind of production concerns that fed into that?
Part of that was just, a lot of it was how much time it took. Or
brewhouse labor.
Yeah. It was way too much time, especially when it was only me doing all the cellar work and then a lot of the brewing. It became way too much work. And so we were able to get racking arms on all of our tanks, which has been very helpful.
It's the little things.
Yeah, the little things.
Yeah. Let's back up then and talk about recipes and the kind of approach to beers. What are the biggest kind of core beers for your consumers that you're making year round and that you focus most on?
So Pils is really the only beer that we make year round. It is our Bohemian style Pilsner. And we have a couple of kind of beers that we've made throughout our existence. We make a Dunkel. We make a Schwarzbier, which it really isn't a Schwarzbier. It's kind of between a Schwarzbier and a Czech dark lager. That's how I would describe it. So we've made those two kind of throughout our existence as a brewery. And then we have a few seasonals, Bobtoberfest, which we actually have coming up. And I just actually tried it today and it's tasting delicious. And that's our kind of German style traditional Märzen.
So you take the Märzen approach to Oktoberfest.
Oh yeah, it's we don't quite brew it in March, but I did brew it in I think I finished brewing it in mid-May this year. So it gets a lot of lagering time.
The more pale fest beer approach that is maybe more current among Oktoberfest fans.
Yeah.
It's such a, in our latest issue of Craft Beer and Brewing, there's Joe Stang wrote a story about that because we've been tracking that. And there is this interesting idea of Oktoberfest from an American perspective that's very much based in Märzen, where the actual fest beers that are served today are much more pale. But the history of Oktoberfest is super weird. And, even looking at where things are today, it's all dynamic and constantly shifting. But you all are sticking with that kind of more Märzen approach to Oktoberfest rather than the more pale fest beer.
Yeah, and we have done the pale variety too. So there's a Oktoberfest that takes place in Mount Angel, which is probably about an hour drive from McMinnville. And we actually did one of the pale Wiesen beers for kind of for them, did a small batch. So that was kind of fun. So, but yeah, our Bobtoberfest is the traditional Märzen. So
when it comes to pills, let's talk about pills for a little bit. What's the creative idea behind pills? You mentioned it's a Bohemian pills, and so I assume we're going to be using, Czech, Pilsner malt, and we're going to be using Czech Satz hops. Are there sources, regions, approaches, ingredient suppliers that you prefer for this that kind of help capture the character that you all are looking for?
So we use a combination for the pills. We use a combination of Weyermann Bohemian Pilsner malt and their floor malted Bohemian Pilsner malt. And then it's pretty much Czech Satz hops. We use a tiny bit of Magnum just to help us a little bit with the bitterness. But other than that, it's Czech Satz all the way through. Heavy first-wort hopping addition. And then kind of lighter as we go on through the boil. And we don't decoct, which I know will piss a lot of people off. So,
well, I don't know. I would say that in my conversations with American lager brewers that the verdict is still out, and that there are plenty of strongly held opinions on both sides, and beautifully made beers with and without.
Yes, truly. And I'm if I had the ability to decoct, I would on our system. I think that's one thing. I think that you make the beer you can with the system that you can. And it's with the system that we have, we can't decoct. So
Why would you decoct if you could?
I just think for Czech style Pilsners, I think it does add a certain mouthfeel. I think that we are able to get it without it, with our mash schedule. And so I don't think that, in that sense, there's an issue. I think it's kind of more of a tradition thing.
Sure.
And I actually think I think decoction adds more of a cool character, for darker beers, in my personal opinion. I think that can add some really nice flavors, and you can get a little bit drier too, which is nice for those darker varieties of beers, heavy or higher gravity beers.
Right. What is it about your mash schedule that you've tweaked in order to kind of, adjust for the fact that, or to create some of the character that you might otherwise get through decoction?
We actually have a pretty standard mash schedule for pills. I think the thing that we do is we mash in pretty heavy, pretty thick. And then we're raising it to probably about 137 degrees. And I think that's what I look at on our mash mixer. And then we actually we add hot liquor to it. And I think that allows you get this kind of like back sweetness because we're kind of raising the temperature pretty fast, because otherwise I think we would maybe get a little bit too dry, because our mash mixer, while it is great, it is not the most efficient. And so it takes a long time to raise the temperatures. And then our next rest, our long rest is at 153. So a very standard kind of schedule. And then we're mashing out at 161. So we don't do like a true mash out temperature on that. And mash schedules is something that I've been messing with a lot lately, but I won't touch pills because I'm like, I don't want to change the flavor profile too much. But yeah, I think kind of doing that quick rise gives us this kind of sweetness, and doesn't allow it. I mean, this starts right around 12. There's some variation between batches, and then it finishes like right around 2.7, 2.6. So we're still getting some of that sweetness. And I think that is kind of what you're looking for in a Bohemian style Pilsner. You kind of want a little bit of that malty sweetness.
Yeah. And then what's the IBU that balances against that?
This is at 36, approximately,
Calculated.
Yeah.
Maybe a little bit bitter for what some people might think of as Bohemian pills.
I think that there's kind of this misconception about a Pilsner is supposed to be pretty hoppy, pretty bitter.
I agree, yeah.
And I think a lot of people, I think especially American audiences, and maybe this is because a lot of the Pilsners that we're getting from Germany and from the Czech Republic are, they're stale, they're a little bit oxidized, so you don't get that super fresh hot flavor.
Right.
But I have yet to go to the Czech Republic. That's next on my list. But I have heard, going there, they're hoppy beers,
Sure,
they have great hop aroma and hop flavor, and should be a little bit bitter. So
they should. This is another one of Joe, our managing editor's, pet issues, is trying to push more bitterness in Pilsner. And he, when he got down to Austin and saw that Real Ale's Hans Pils was a 55 IBU Pilsner, he's like, I've got to go find that. And of course, he's been on a mission to convince other people that they should make Pilsner at that kind of IBU level. So, but I digress. So that creates a nice balance, and that amount of bitterness. When we're talking about sweetness, even 2.6, 2.7 is just pretty mild, and it's there. It creates some body and a little bit of heft, but it's not. Normal people don't perceive that as sweet per se. Yeah. And especially with that extra kind of oomph of bitterness, you'd probably want that kind of, little bit of sweetness in there just to kind of help offset. Are there any other, methods or levers that you pull to kind of create a character to that, on the mash and ingredient side?
I really think that, we haven't always this was something that we added. When did we start? So first-wort hopping, I'm a huge fan of. We do it in all of our beers. I can't remember the year when we started doing it. I think it was when we transferred to when we installed the 15-barrel system that we have now. I think it was shortly after that. But just kind of reading a little bit about first-wort hopping, and we were kind of like, oh, we should try this. And definitely noticed a different mouthfeel in the beer. And I don't know if it's like a huge thing, but I definitely, like, when we did kind of a side-by-side, we were like, I don't know if it's huge, but I definitely like this one better that's been first-wort hopped.
How would you describe the difference in mouthfeel between a first-wort hop beer and one that wasn't?
Oh man, it's been such a long time since I mean, I'm sure I have plenty of non-first wort hopped beers. But it's kind of like I would say this smoothness that you get. I don't know. It's hard to kind of really describe, but it just it felt like it was a cleaner hop flavor, if that makes any sense.
Sure, absolutely.
So yeah,
that becomes the holy grail for that kind of mid bitterness level, like having it there and present, but having that kind of softer entry, or at least that kind of rounded edge as you pop into this thing. Like it's still big and firm, but you just ease into it rather than it just coming across as ragged or abrasive, or this kind of like sawtooth kind of grating bitterness, and that becomes the thing that it gives it a polish that that can be really pleasant for the drinker.
Yeah. Low alpha hops, first wort hop. And I think it's funny. I've talked to other brewers about first wort hop, and they're like, oh yeah, we first wort hop. And they're like on a 60 barrel system, and they add like 500 grams of hops. And I'm like, oh, I'm adding like 3 kilos at like, so we do a heavy load.
So you're doing a lot of first wort hops then.
Yeah, we have a heavy load, especially on pills. And yeah, I do think you did a great description. I think it does have like the certain polish that you get, and kind of a lingering hop flavor and a hop bitterness that you don't necessarily get otherwise. It's like more finessed.
Yeah. And that's figuring out how brewers do these things is the fascinating piece for me. And so there it is, first wort, but a lot of first wort hops.
A lot of first wort hops.
A lot. Okay. Like in terms of percentage, how much is coming in first wort? How much pops in later in the boil? And do you dry hop or not?
No dry hop. Man, at least half of our hop load. I'm trying to do I think it probably is about half of our hops that go into pills are at first wort, maybe slightly less. Mm-hmm. So, and we do a pretty standard, we do kind of like an old school hopping for pills as well. So nothing at the beginning of boil, and then we do like a 15-minute to end of boil addition, and then we do a whirlpool addition, which I know is so taboo these days, but
is it taboo?
It works.
I don't know.
I feel like everyone I talked to lately is like, oh man, you still do whirlpool additions? And I'm like, why not? So
well, I guess conceptually I can see it, that if you've got that much hop load that's in your boil from first wort all the way through, then you're potentially volatilizing a whole lot of aromatic compounds, even though you're isomerizing the shit out of everything.
Yeah.
And also coming up with something bitter and trying to make sure you're punching some aroma in there in a way that, adds that to it. It just makes sense in a general way to me. Doesn't seem that weird. Doesn't seem that weird, right?
Yeah.
Let's talk about some of the other lagers you brew. What's you mentioned the Shtick Alt. Are there other favorite lagers that you make? Is that some of your other lager children here, these recipes that you've developed and that you've been able to kind of keep working on? What are some of the favorites that you make, and what makes them so interesting to you?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I think the Zwickel beer, which is I say Franconian style amber lager, that's a Marsbrau. Ungespunden, that's a clone. I kind of modeled that beer off of that beer from Marsbrau, which is one of my favorite beers. And I've been really happy with that. This last year, I think I really kind of got it in its sweet spot.
How? What is it? And I'm curious, like, how do you taste a Marsbrau beer and say, I'm going to make my version of this?
I think
what's
part
that
of
creative process look like?
I think it was kind of a lot of it is just like, okay, if I were to, how I kind of see it is, if I were to build this beer, what would I do? And then it's also doing some research of like, oh, well, like what, since I don't necessarily know, what are the most likely hops that they used in this? And, tasting it and kind of figuring out, even, how dry is this? Like, what's the mash schedule? What do I need to like figure out to like get this, the way I want it. So kind of that, it's, kind of and for that beer, it's been a little bit of a trial and error because I think, the first time, and it's never going to be a clone, obviously. It's the first time I made it, I think it was like a little bit too dark. So it's like, okay, I need to scale back on, it's the version that I do is heavy in Vienna malt. So it's like, and I can't even remember the first time I brewed it if I probably had some crystal in there, which I think I probably just took out. And yeah, kind of going from there and seeing like, how can I, and I think one of the things for me was like, I need to make this a little bit drier. The hop character isn't right. I need to change the hops and use some really delicious Hersbrucker in it this year. And I think that was like, okay, Hersbrucker's a hop I need to use for this. After, I think I did Spalt in one batch. I can't remember what I did in the first batch I did of that beer, but.
What is it about Hersbrucker that just made it click?
I think it was kind of, Hersbrucker just has this really, it has a spiciness, but it also has this nice floral quality. And it's not, I think it's like, I want to almost say like pungent, but it's not pungent. It's like, it's pungent in the right ways. So I think that beer does have like, sometimes for me, floral hops get a little bit too floral. And,
sure.
And in this beer, I wanted something that had like kind of a little bit of that spice character. And I think Hersbrucker has a good balance of that.
Sure. It's another lager, of your creation that you really enjoy making these days.
I love making Bobtoberfest. It's a fun beer to make. It's a beer that also is named after my Uncle Bob, who passed away. And so it's kind of a way to remember him as well. So that's just, and it's one of my favorite beers we make. So,
yeah.
So I love that beer. And
what makes it your favorite? And what do you, how do you put your Heater Allen twist on it?
So it's definitely kind of a more traditional Märzen. I would say it's probably slightly, I feel like all of our beers probably lean a little bit more bitter than their German counterparts.
Sounds good to me.
Yeah, this beer, we try to lager it for at least 12 weeks. So it gets a long lagering time. And it's during the summer too. So tank space is like precious that time of year, but
yeah,
we make sure to and it's one of our more popular seasonals. So, and that's a beer too that, I've been kind of fiddling with the mash schedule a little bit, trying to get it a little bit drier. That's kind of what I've been doing lately. And we also this is not brewing related, but there's this playlist that we always listen to when we brew it that is like all my uncle's favorite songs and that sort of thing. So it's just kind of a good memorial situation. And yeah.
Well, making beers that are meaningful and that, have that kind of connection and feel like family is as important as having the best recipe and the best process around it.
Yeah, totally.
In a kind of bigger picture, let's zoom out for a minute. It's a tough thing being a small lager brewer making even that kind of production but being profitable at having a business making lager beer. It's something that people expect to pay a little bit less for than, say, an $18 4-pack of heavily hopped, hazy IPA. There's the price expectation around it, and it's generally speaking a volume game where brewers that make lager make a lot of lager, and they do fine as a business because they make a bunch of beer. It's tough to do it at the kind of scale that you all are doing it, and yet there's clearly a love and a passion for what you do. How do you manage to a business at that kind of scale and make sure that number one, that the bills are paid, that people get paid, and that people can enjoy this process and have the lives they want to live, while trying to make enough beer to make enough money and keep the everything rolling along of this lager program?
I think part of it is very like the simple thing of there's a reason the brewery was started in McMinnville. Rent is cheaper here.
Sure,
utilities are cheaper here. It's also kind of one of those things that we self-distribute as well. So, there's no middleman between us and our retailers. And we do work with we work with a distributor in California and a small distributor here in Oregon that does like Bend and the coast and stuff for us. But yeah, I think that's been a huge reason that we've been able to, stick around and have a competitive price for our beer as well. Because you have other breweries that are making a lot of lager and they're with a distributor, and, even if we can charge the same price they're charging, but we're getting, more of that margin. So, that's just simple, math. And there were a lot of people at the beginning that, I think thought my dad was a little crazy for trying to sell a keg of lager for the price that he was.
There might still be some people that think he's crazy for that.
Yeah. And I think too, we've always kind of slowly grown, and I think, we are still planning on growing. I think we want to get a little bit bigger. We do have plans for tank purchases in the near future and things like that. So it's not, it's kind of just a slow growth process rather than just, spending a ton of money to begin with. It's kind of spending the money as we have it and as we're able to spend it. So my dad, his first job was in finance. So
he's applied that rigor and financial discipline to this business and made sure that you all don't owe anyone and aren't beholden to other folks for what you do.
Yeah. I think if he had investors or something, we would probably either not still be in business or we'd be a lot bigger than we are.
Fair enough. What's the big picture for Heater Allen, and what do you hope to achieve, and how would you define success, and when will you know if you achieve it?
I think eventually my dad will officially retire. I have always wanted to have more of a direct to consumer presence. I have worked in front of the house stuff prior to going into the beer industry. And I think that there's a potential for growth in that area. So I think in the next few years, we're going to really revamp our tap room that is essentially still closed. We closed it because of COVID and just have not reopened it. And so I'd really like to kind of develop that. And also, there's, little but not little things eventually down the road, getting our own canning line, getting a few more lagering tanks so we can, brew more beer. Just kind of, I still see our growth as being somewhat slow, but I think there are things that I'm kind of a little bit more ready for than I think, I think my dad never really wanted to, have a tap room of any sort, because that's a whole other business. I I think that's what the consumer is really, really wants. And I think that we have a cool space that we could, make a really cool experience for people. So I think that's kind of where my focus is right now, aside from obviously making great beer.
Sure.
And yeah, and
rethinking the customer experience at the brewery and how they feel connected to where the beer is made.
Yeah. And there's some small things too. I think that the brewery we have, or the brew system we have, is from, late 2013. Got it at the end of beginning of December, I think was our first batch of 2013. We brewed on the brew house we have now. And so there's just things that we're needing to replace. So some of it is just making some improvements. We need to repipe our glycol, kind of little things like that, just to make sure we're making the best beer we can and having the best situation for that as well.
Sure. Well, Lisa, thanks for joining me on this episode of the podcast. G&D chillers will hit 28 degrees without breaking a sweat. Set your compass by Raw North Star Pills. Craft juice concentrates from Old Orchard are the cost-effective solution for your fruit-forward needs. Brewmation puts you in control to design a brewery that fits your needs and make your system 100% food safe with Clarion lubricants. Of course, if you'd like to support this podcast, go to beerandbrewing.com, click on the subscribe button. If you're a pro brewer, or consider our new All Access Pro subscriptions that combine the magazines plus exclusive content, like those classes that I was filming last week out in California with some really fantastic folks. Classes with everyone from brewers from Firestone Walker to Russian River, Alvarado Street, Cellar Maker. It's going to be fantastic. Anyway, sign up for All Access, be a part of that. Upcoming, this is episode 198, which gets us, we're really close to episode 200. And I've got a special guest for that one that's already recorded in a special, beautiful location out on the coast of California. So tune in for that one. But Lisa, thanks for joining me on the podcast. If people want to learn more about Heater Allen, where do they find you?
Our website, heaterallen.com. Instagram is @heaterallenbeer. And yeah.
Of course, read the cover story in the latest issue of the Brewing Industry Guide because, it's a fantastic story of family, craft, lager, and everything else. Thanks for joining me on the podcast. Cheers.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media @craftbeerbrew.